All right, so welcome everybody to the STAR Intro to Programming class, front-end, back-end conversation that we have usually about midway through your course to be able to go over what your options are once you complete the Intro to Programming class. So your Intro to Programming course is setting you up with all sorts of JavaScript basics, HTML, CSS. You're getting familiar with GitHub and Git commands. And at the end, you'll also be doing an API fetch. So it's having your site talk to another server and pull data from that server. So once you have all of those basics down, then that should prepare you well enough to be able to go on to one of our two advanced classes. The ones that will be following your Intro to Programming class will be either Ruby on Rails for the back end, or it will be React for the front end. And I just want to take a look at our calendar again real quick, just so I can let you know sort of dates as far as what that's going to look like for when that'll start and stop. The classes following the intro class will have a practicum portion at the end of them. So the first 17 weeks of both types of advanced classes, you're going to see very similar kind of structure as what you have in Intro to Programming right now, where you'll just be doing individual assignments and you'll turn them in for review. The final 8 weeks after your first 17 weeks of individual work, the final 8 weeks will be practicum, where you're put into small groups to work on a full app that can be deployed. And it'll either be in front end or back end, or we might try and combine a couple of you and do a full stack app to be able to deploy. But the practicum portion really gives you a chance to be able to get some teamwork on your experience and on your resume. And it helps you kind of figure out all of the ins and outs of best practices for working on a team when you have multiple different people working on different bits and pieces of the same code. So it works on like merge conflicts and things like that in GitHub. Okay, so STAR wraps up your Intro to Programming class right now, wraps up on December 21st. And then you'll have several weeks off between, and your advanced classes will start on March 2nd. So since you'll have a little bit of a gap, we'll have resources available that you can kind of keep your skills sharp in JavaScript. If you want to start looking ahead in some of those advanced classes a week or two early, you're welcome to do that. But March 2nd is the official start date for those classes. The individual portion runs until June 28th, and then the practicum portion goes from June 29th until August 23rd. So that just kind of gives you an idea of what that rundown is like so far for timeline for what you're looking at. So without further ado, feel free to unmute yourselves if you have any questions about that process for getting into those advanced classes, or if you have questions about back end versus front end. We have some awesome people here with us tonight. We've got Kwesi that has been a back-end developer in our dev shop side, Code the Dream Labs, for a while, and has recently gotten a job with Tango in back-end development. We have Lila Alderman, who is with us. She's one of your mentors, so you probably already recognize her face. But she works with GitHub, and she also is very comfortable and familiar with the back end. And then representing front end, we have Tom Rao. He's our lead instructor in the front end class for React. And Elliot, who you have not seen because Elliot did the intro class before you. But Elliot is our curriculum builder for the React class as well. So Tom and Elliot will cover front end questions. So I'm going to go ahead and mute myself unless you have questions about administrative things, and just fire off your questions and we will chime in with answers. And you will have to unmute yourselves. Oh, Lawrence, you can go ahead and lower your hand and unmute yourself and ask your question.
I have a question. I heard that for the backend, this will be the last Ruby, and you're switching over to React. Is this correct?
Node.
Yeah, we'll be switching to Node instead of React. React is our front end portion.
But not React. I mean Express. Sorry, Express.
Yeah. I don't know if it'll be Node Express or if it's just Node, but
It's
it'll
pretty
definitely
much always Node and Express.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, that'll be the route that we're taking. We have not gotten too far into the realm of developing that curriculum quite yet, but that will be an offering starting hopefully with the June cohorts.
So it would be doable to do if we wanted to front end and then segue into back end for Express eventually.
Yep, absolutely. And if you want to do backend in Ruby on Rails first, and then do Node, which will kind of give you a little bit more of a full stack experience, and that's something that you can do as well. So that's always an option if you want to take Ruby on Rails first in the March classes, and then once those complete, then take a Node class following that, you can.
I'd love to learn more about the practicum portion. Like, is there like I'm sure there is some sort of like project in mind for both back end and front end. And what does that look like?
There is. It'll depend a little bit on the number of individuals that we have completing the advanced classes and rolling into the practicum portion, because we do have some students that life gets in the way and they fall behind. So based on what our numbers look like and where we're at with our curriculum, it'll either be 3 to 5 individuals at the most, probably more like 3 to 4 individuals on a team. And you have an outline for your curriculum. So it'll be similar to what you're doing in the first 17 weeks. It's just the curriculum will be it sort of in and of itself. It will still build from week to week on each other. And it'll be a little bit more involved because you'll have to have weekly communications amongst your team as far as who's going to work on what bug fixes, who's going to do what features, and kind of scope the project as far as who's going to be addressing what, and make sure that you're all learning everything, even though you're working on different bits and pieces of the same project. I think since we're getting a little slow a start to the questions, Tom, if you'd like to kind of just give a quick little rundown, Tom or Elliot, if you'd like to give a quick rundown about what front end versus full stack means, and then Lila and or Kwesi, if you'd like to give a rundown about back end, just so students can kind of have a context about what we're talking about, and that might help inspire some questions among the students. So Tom, if you'd like to share.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that traditionally front end, or at least, I mean, things have definitely changed a lot, I think, but traditionally front end was always it's always been the client side working with the code that makes the browser run. And so that means user experience, user interactions, I think, styling. Over time, there's like been more and more of a crossover, and now there's a lot of tools that allow you to build without a database necessarily, and they kind of are that layer. And so front-end developers, I think, more and more have to be, really know a lot of full stack tools like data structuring and things like that that weren't originally part of the deal, which is awesome and amazing. But I think that there's a lot more crossover now, and that's probably the front end, in my opinion, I think has changed more recently, or maybe, I don't know, that's probably my opinion because I'm more of a front end developer. And then back end is definitely still very focused on databases, and the API layer that talks to the databases. Those are really like the two giant pieces, and then all kinds of DevOps things and the kind of middleware pieces. And but I think everyone probably knows that to a certain extent. So yeah, I don't know. I'll let Elliot add on to that, and then I really want to know, Kwasi, what you feel like you've learned as far as like what you kind of originally thought about back end versus front end, and then just from having a job most recently and probably being closest to a peer of all the students, kind of like how your perceptions have changed. So I guess Elliot, I'll let you go now. Also, Elliot is more of a lead instructor, I feel like, in this class in most ways than me as far as designing the curriculum. And it's like taken such a heavy load, and I just, I want to say thank you. We're so grateful, and really that's it. So.
It's been fun. Yeah, so front end, like Tom sort of touched on it. We've had the World Wide Web for a little over like 25 years or something, right? It's very young. And it started out with very little of the web being in the browser, right? So when you're talking about web development, you had this HTML that was served up from the server side, all of the styling for that content was in with the content as well. And so over time, front end has really matured as a discipline, and browsers have improved to be able to handle much more than they could early on. So we now have very complex JavaScript running in the browser. You can have an entire application that is only client side, and it can do what a server side application would be able to do. And so that's where it's really changed. I think front end is moving a little bit quicker than back end in some respects because it is a younger discipline. But it kind of depends where you're working and what you're working on. But you can experience a little bit more of like having to change and learn new things like really quickly if you're working on front end because it's evolving so fast. And I always like to tell people like to not pay attention to sort of the boxes that front end and back end are placed in. A lot of times you might hear that front end is for like people who like design and are very creative, and back end is for people who are not as good at design and more logical oriented in their thinking. And it's really not that way. Really, those different types of thinking are useful in front end and back end, and you get to do both. When you're working in back end, designing databases, designing APIs, you're doing a lot of creative thinking. You're doing a lot of design. You're having to think about user experience because you have people using your APIs. So how are they structured? How are they used? Same with front end. You're obviously doing design and creating interfaces that people interact with, but you're also a lot of times building complex logic that lives on that front end to power different parts of the application. So I think whichever area is more interesting to you is always what I try to recommend people to do. If you're more interested in databases and systems and that sort of thing, or if you're more interested in interfaces, to kind of go that route. But it's less about what kinds of thinking you're applying and more about what the application is. But that's what I got.
Awesome. Thanks, Tom and Elliot. Lila and Kwesi, if you wouldn't mind sharing a little bit about backend and sort of what it is that you'll be doing sort of on a day-to-day and your favorite parts of it, and any experiences that you have, especially recently, Kwesi, as far as working in it, or Lila as well, since you've got more experience working with it, sort of your perspectives on it would be great.
I'll definitely yield to Lila to explain what backend is, because she was also one of my mentors when I started. So I think she'll give a really good explanation. And then I can share my experience after and what I do.
Sure. Yeah. So I worked as a backend developer, Ruby on Rails, for a company that our product was a payment processing API. So we were an entire company of backend devs. Yeah. So we made an API that talked to other APIs. So my days were spent working with APIs and their structures and writing tests and making sure things passed. The really nice thing about backend work is that you get to test everything. Front end work is really hard to put tests around everything. So that was a lot of my job, was dealing, like, I didn't really touch databases at all. It was all APIs. And I kind of came at choosing backend and choosing Ruby on Rails from a far more practical perspective of it was the best way for me to get a job, because I was self-taught a few years ago. I used the Odin project. That was the only thing that I did, was study the Odin project, and got a job from that. And from a completely practical perspective, if you look at jobs for developers in your market, you are going to see a ton of JavaScript jobs. I am never going to argue that. JavaScript is hugely popular. But because JavaScript is hugely popular, everybody is learning it. Every boot camp teaches it. And so there's tons of competition for junior JavaScript jobs. Nobody's learning Ruby on Rails. there is no competition for junior Ruby on Rails jobs. And there are still tons of junior positions that still need to be taken. There's still tons of applications that people made a decade ago that need to be maintained. And yeah, Ruby on Rails not nearly as popular as JavaScript, but like I said, I worked at a company that was Ruby on Rails, and we literally couldn't find enough junior Ruby on Rails developers. We had to hire a guy who had learned Python and Django in his boot camp, and we hired him and he had to learn Ruby and Rails on the job because we just couldn't find enough people. So from a completely practical perspective, that is why I'm a huge advocate of learning Ruby on Rails and backend, is because there's so much more demand than there is supply.
That was an amazing pitch, Lila, for real. That was
That was
good.
amazing.
Thanks.
It was all 100% right, I think, also.
Yeah.
I'm glad that you were here and said that.
I'm so
Yeah.
glad you went first.
I'm a huge advocate of learning Ruby, and like I said, like pure numbers wise, tons more JavaScript jobs, but there's tons more JavaScript developers. And yeah, so when I learned Ruby on Rails with the Odin project, there was just nobody learning Rails at the time, even just a few years ago. And yeah, you just can't find enough of them.
Can I ask a question? So I was in a session yesterday with Lila, and I had asked her for some advice, and I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts too. So coming off the pandemic, I know that one of my main drives or goals is to be employed quickly. So I was originally leaning towards back end. But so what I did is I did a job search just in my local area. And what I found is that most of the positions are for React, few for Ruby. So what, and Lila gives some really, really great things to consider. I'm really interested in to hear what other advice or thoughts people think, I should take into consideration when choosing the next course.
Yeah, I think if I had to give any advice, I think I would really advise focusing on what you will like more. I know that sounds crazy than being employed. It sounds nuts, but you have more control over doing something you like and less control over whether you get hired or not. Right? For example, right, you can apply for 200 jobs and that's out of your control. You work hard, you do what you can, but if you choose a software that let's say you do front end and you really don't like it, but it does get you employed, it may not keep you in it long term because you may not really like it, right? Or if you choose back end and you do fall in love with back end, you may stick with it longer because you like it. So I think my advice would really be pick something you do like. If you love data, if you love being able to manipulate databases and working with API and being able to control where the data goes and how the data flow and just being able to work in a backend, and it's just, you get excited about those kind of challenges, then I think maybe that'd be the path to go. If you like front end, where you like user experience, you like being able to design, you like, then that might be, but my advice would be picking something you like because you'll stay long term. But if you do it for employment, let's say you learn it in 6 months, but it's out of your control on when you get employed, you may give up on it and jump on something else. And that was kind of my experience. I learned backend as a Ruby on Rails developer because I really wanted to be employed quickly. I had moved to North Carolina. I was new in the area. I was working a lot of not so great jobs, to be quite honest. And right when I graduated, I was like at so many companies. I went to ThoughtBot. I went to so many companies looking to be hired. And I just, as a developer, I wasn't ready. Everyone has a different experience. So please, my experience will not be yours. But in my personal experience, I just wasn't ready. But because I love backend developing so much, it helped me not to give up. It helped me not to jump onto something else or jump onto something. Because I loved it so much, I stuck to it. I started enjoying it. And because I loved it so much, then I was looking for internships that would kind of pay me to work so that I can keep learning and keep growing. But I can only imagine if I didn't like it, and then if I wasn't getting hired, I might have jumped ship and try to find something else that might get me employed. So I would really, sit down and really try to decide which one of these do I really like, because it may keep you longer in doing it if things don't go according to plan. Might be good advice, might be terrible advice, but. I don't know if anyone else has something on
Is there any do we have any counter arguments, Elliot or Lana? Or Mary Alice?
I'll throw out a small counterpoint.
No, please. I think that's important.
So my small counterpoint is that I don't really stick around anywhere very long. One of the biggest things that I got out of the experience of learning how to code was I can teach myself anything. So you get into tech and kind of the world is your oyster. There's so many different things you can do in tech. I mean, there's DevOps and security and front end and back end, and like the list just goes on and on forever, right? And there's just so much out there. And so if you get started as a developer and you start stacking skills on top of that, because like you've gone through this experience, you know that you have the wherewithal to teach yourself and to go and to learn quickly, you can go do whatever you want. So if you get started as a front end dev and you're like, this sucks, you jump. Like I worked as a backend developer for a year and a half, and now I'm not a developer anymore. I work in cybersecurity and I love it. I mean, it's just, you can do whatever you want.
Yeah, that's a good counter argument, I think.
very good kind of argument. And Layla is right. You can't do whatever you want. I mean, even in Code to Dream, I've seen students come and get a job in a week or two. Even at the job that I'm at, there's a gentleman I'm working with. He started with Code to Dream, Peter, and I think he was at the practicum and got a job during that process before he even became an intern. So I mean, everything is possible, And Lila is right. I think the biggest thing to learning development is learning how to learn. And once you learn that skill, you can go wherever you are. I also work with a guy right now who was a backend developer. His name is Graham at my new company. And he was like, I hate developing. Now he's a product manager, So it is, you can flow and wherever you may feel. So I think both of it is really good advice. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it depends on what your goals are right away. So if your goals are to get employed as quickly as possible, find the area where you're looking to be employed, look at the jobs, look at the numbers, and what is going to be your best bet. Like Lila was saying, if there's really high demand and low supply for a particular type of developer, shoot for that area to get yourself in. But there's going to be like, if that's not your goal, if your goal is to more like find something that you're going to learn on long term and maybe get some more practice and experience, and then find that job that is like suited for you and spend some more time on that. Maybe go for what you're more interested in, right? So if you go learn Rails and more of the jobs for Rails are maintaining legacy software, not all of them are, some shops use Rails still, but a lot of them is going to be legacy software. For some people, that's really great experience. For juniors, maybe fixing bugs, jumping into systems and doing little things. It might also not be the most interesting work. You might not be doing like a bunch of new feature development and innovative stuff. And so if that's what you really want to do in tech, go after a stack that's going to get you that experience and put you on that road. Just depends on what goals you have, I would say.
The only other thing I want to add, and this is kind of a tangent, is that I know we talked really early about the switching to Node. I think if don't let that dissuade you from learning Rails. I think that you're going to learn a lot of the backend skills with databases and building APIs specifically that will translate. And you're also going to learn to continue to do some JavaScript. So I don't think that that's like a reason not to take it. And like Lana said, there are tons of like well, I shouldn't say tons of Rails jobs necessarily, but like very little Rails competition. So I have no idea how that plays out because there are lots of front end jobs. So it's who knows, but yeah, I think just make sure that like if you're learning back end, you're learning it's a larger skill set than just the language you're learning. I mean, in the same with the front end also, but
Yeah, I think that's a great point because especially for front end, like we talked about how quickly front end is changing, it's also like we have a lot of hedges like placed our bets on in front end. So there's all these big libraries that are trying to do things a different way, and we're trying to figure out where like front end development is moving, right? Back end is a little bit more stable of an environment to be developing in. So for front end, we're teaching React because it's a very popular library for doing front end development with JavaScript. But there's also other very popular ones, Vue.js, Angular, etc. So you might go through our front end React class and become a front end developer and never use React again. You might have to end up learning a different library or a different framework altogether. So it is, and same for Rails. You might go through the backend class, learn Rails. You might end up at a job doing Node.js or Java or something else. So it is just, figure out which area you'd rather be in, but using the course as a way to learn how to learn that thing and get the concepts, and not necessarily go away with that as your stack entering into your career.
Thanks for adding that last part, because after y'all said you were switching the back end, I was like, a little worried there for a minute.
I think one good takeaway, regardless of what class you want to go in, whatever stack you want to work in, and one thing that we're working on with the current advanced classes is to try and build sort of this mindset of how to be a programmer, period, because technology is just going to keep changing, and there are going to be newer advancements and newer technologies that come out. Maybe there's going to be a redirect to having more programs needing to be written for all these home personal assistants and other various devices that haven't even been created yet. So to have that versatility to really think about what are the questions that you're asking, why should you be asking those questions, how will you come up with ideas for solutions to those questions, those are sort of the bigger picture things that we want you to take away regardless of what level class you're in. So even as you're in your intro class, we want you thinking, okay, well, why should I set it up that way? If I set it up a different way, is it going to be better or worse? Things of that nature. And then as you move into your advanced classes, and those questions will get even deeper, but the questions will be the same regardless of if you're building something in React, if you're building something in Rails, if you're building something in Python, whatever it is, you still have to get at what is my data? What am I going to be doing with it? Who needs to use it? How do they need to use it? Questions like that. So having sort of those bigger picture ideas cemented throughout your course will help make it more versatile if you do decide you need or want to make a change to any other tech stack or language or technology as things change over the years too. So just keep that in mind, regardless of what class you're in with us.
So as far as the advanced classes go, will we have to resubmit in our application, or and is there already a seat saved for us? How's that going to work?
As long as you complete your final project to where it's obvious that you have sufficiently retained the information that you need from Intro to Programming. So if you're checking all of your boxes on your final project rubric for that portfolio site that you'll be building, then you should be able to advance into one of the advanced classes of your choosing. You will apply, and your final project will serve as the equivalent of the pre-work project that you did to get into the intro class. So that is sort of the test as to whether or not you'll make it into the advanced class. So you really want to make sure that you're putting your best foot forward when you're building your final projects. Make use of your mentors, make use of one-on-one sessions to really iron out any wrinkles and fully understand any concepts that might be tripping you up along the way. And then from there, as long as your final project is sufficient and we can tell that you did well in the intro and you understood the material and you were active in the class, so showing up for your mentor sessions, helping people in the discussion channel or posting questions in the discussion channel, things of that nature, then that all plays into whether or not you get moved to the advanced class. Typically, there's always a seat for our intro students. We give priority to the intro students because you've already proven your worth as you work through the intro class. So you all are more likely to get a seat than a new applicant trying to come into an advanced class. Does that help answer the question, Quenisha?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, perfect. All right, what other questions do we have out there tonight, folks?
Will be participating in either front end or back end. Just kind of getting an idea of, you know, yeah.
So if full stack is like kind of like a, I've 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 heard that like it's not like an actual thing. Why is it still kind of like advertised in job boards?
I don't know when someone said it's not a thing exactly what the
Like it's not like a, I guess like a true position, or I guess it's like
I mean, I think that there's definitely jobs that people would take at startup companies and things like that, where you're really responsible for building an entire app, and just some jobs, especially I think some Node, when you get into full stack JavaScript applications, you will see people that really want you to be able to go like API, like Mongo, all the way to front end. And I think as companies grow, like generally people probably get pushed in one direction or the other, but there's still a lot of Rails apps out there that are, I would consider full stack applications that are pretty big. So yeah, I'm not sure.
Yeah. So I think it really depends on the company, size of the company, the nature of the work, and what their org structure is like. But you can either have a role that is more of a generalist in software or more of a specialist. And a lot of companies do hire generalists so that they can pretty much work in any area of the application. So that would be a full stack developer. You can do front end and back end work across the whole stack. Some companies don't hire people like that. They hire specialists. So they want you to specifically be sort of expert in front end or back end, but not necessarily both. So it just really depends on the company, but certainly those full stack roles exist. And especially depending on the stack that company uses. So for instance, at my job, we just rebuilt our website and we built it with Next.js. So we're using React, but we use it on the server side. We do server-side rendering of our React components. So I'm actually doing full stack development work. I'm, writing code that runs on the server. I'm doing API stuff to serve up those pages and caching, etc. But I'm also working inside JSX in that same file and doing front-end development at the same time. So there are certainly roles that are full stack or ones that are more specialist to one side or the other. It just depends on the job. And certainly you want people more specialized, especially the bigger company. Like I think we should have more specialists, but that can communicate across platform, right? So being able to be a front-end developer, but understand back-end concepts so that you can collaborate with the back-end developer and say, these are the things I need in my API, or the performance of this could be improved. It's slowing down the front end. Same for on back-end, being able to talk to a front-end developer and to be able to have that collaboration in between is really helpful. So that's where a lot of companies look for people who are full stack, not necessarily to use you as a full stack person, but so that you have that knowledge and expertise to be a better contributor. So, yeah.
I gotcha. Thank you.
I have a question about pace. So in the advanced courses, is it kicked up a little bit? Is it similar?
I think it's probably Similar, except for I think it might feel, I don't know, it's probably feels more ramped up in spots where there's certainly weeks where I think you're getting a lot of different concepts, especially maybe on the front end side, where there's a few big concepts you'll have to learn in a few of the weeks where it's probably, it might feel overwhelming, especially if you get like caught up on anything. But as a whole, I think, and I think we might even move some things, one or two things around potentially, but I think it's probably a similar pace. I don't know, Elliot, what do you think? Do you think it's sped up?
Yeah, I can't speak to Rails because I haven't been through it, but for the advanced front end React class, I would say the amount of concepts you're getting each week is about the same, but the concepts are a little bit heavier. Like these are more advanced concepts than the fundamental ones you get in the intro class. So you really do have to dig in, and it takes a little bit more to get your head wrapped around some of the concepts. At the same time, in the React course, you're not using Treehouse, which Treehouse just throws hours and hours of videos at you for you to get through. We're using a curriculum that you read through, and there's also, we have video components, but it's much, much shorter. And so you might get through the reading a little bit quicker, but you might have to read it a couple times. Whereas you might have watched the intro videos maybe once. So that's where I would say it's different is I think the pacing's similar in terms of the quantity of concepts. The readings may be a little bit quicker to get through, but you might have to go over it a few times because the concepts are just more in depth. And that's for the front end side in particular.
Is there a way to access the curriculum to get an overview, more or less?
Yeah, that's a good question, Tom.
I think, Mary asked, do we have the overall curriculum on the websites that we could share, right? Yeah, I think we can.
Sorry,
post
I had to get to my unmute button and it was on the other side of the screen. Woo! Anyway, yes, Canary and Crawfish are the classes that are the most recent back-end front-end classes that are currently running. So if you go to the learn.codethedream.org site, just the main site, where, the same one that houses STAR, you can click to either of those classes and take a look to see sort of what the topics are that are covered and what the content is that's there. For the React class, you won't be able to access the textbook for it because we're given a specific number of licenses for the number of students we have in each class. So you wouldn't be able to access that text ahead of time. And I don't know if you'd be able, I don't know if Treehouse would let you take a look at the Ruby on Rails videos ahead of time or not, if you're not assigned to that
You
track.
can't watch them, but I think you might be able to look. I'm not positive about this. But
Okay.
I think you might be able to see like either a preview or a description of each one, but I can't
Perfect.
say that for sure.
Yeah,
think
so
we
that way it
should
can at least give
do-
you ideas, yeah.
I think we should do the same for React. This is our first time using this curriculum that we're using for React. So I think we should probably have like a synopsis of each module, just to give an overview of what is going to be discussed. And so we can't share the material outright, but we could probably share sort of a summary.
These are great questions, guys. Keep them coming.
Has everyone decided who's on the fence?
I honestly like both, but yes, I'm just debating what to choose first, but it'll be fun. And mainly because I guess I'm still exploring. I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm still not like, I can go either or. Yeah.
There's plenty of time to learn both also. So like, you don't feel like you're gonna make a wrong decision. You're just gonna make a decision with a different path. I was thinking earlier when this call started, I don't know what I would decide if I had to just start over right now.
I had the same thing when I was starting. I didn't really know which one to pick, but they both were interesting.
I'm still exploring and I'm kind of waiting to get through more of my coursework. But I think I'm leaning towards back end. But again, I kind of want to get through more of my coursework.
Yeah, Lawrence, you can unmute and ask your question. Go ahead.
Oh, for the front end people, how much CSS do you have to work with, or do you guys just use a library and call it a day?
So
Like,
My
do you
per-
write, do you write CSS from scratch, or?
sometimes, yeah. Honestly, when I do projects on my own, I almost always write CSS from scratch. But in a lot of big companies, I think it's just so much faster to use components, libraries for a lot of the things, especially like user interfaces. There's a lot of good stuff out there for React, but I think learning CSS well is an important skill.
Yeah, so I think that gets into really these two sides of the stack we're talking about isn't the full picture, because when you get into front end roles now, because front end has grown so much, you really have the front of the front end and the back of the front end. So you will have people who work on like single page application sites such as like React sites who only work with JavaScript. They'll be called like JavaScript engineers, and they're only writing logic for that application to run and talk to APIs, etc. And then you'll have people who are only doing the front of the front end and building the components and styling the interface, etc., and not doing any of the logic. So it really depends on where you go in and specialize and what's interesting to you. Backend has a similar thing at some places. You might be way deep into the database management, or you might be up at the interface level working on the APIs and their design. So yeah, it depends on the role essentially. So if you want to be working on the front of the front end or a more generalist front end person, you want to really know CSS. It's very, very important to understand not just the concepts that you're learning in intro when it comes to CSS, but there's much more advanced stuff that we'll go into. If you want to be like more of a back of the front end or just working somewhere that already uses a library, just knowing how to use that library might be enough, and you don't necessarily know how to build CSS and understand all of its advanced concepts. But yeah, it's just hard to say. I've been at companies where we've used component libraries like Bootstrap and things like that. I've been at companies where I've had to build a component library from scratch because it needed to be proprietary and fit the needs of that business. I've been at places where we didn't use any library at all, and we were all handcrafting CSS. I worked at some agencies and stuff. So if you're doing more like marketing facing websites where things have to be styled to a T and be exactly how the designers want them to look, knowing CSS really, really well is important for that type of job. And then at the company I'm at now, we've switched to using a utility CSS library. So we're using Tailwind CSS. So I'm writing CSS with classes. So I still have to know CSS and all the properties and how to make that work. So I think there's two very important skills, knowing CSS and how it works fundamentally, knowing how to interpret and use a CSS library. Both are very, very important skills for a front-end developer, not just knowing how to write CSS, but how to use a library of CSS that's already written. And that goes for anything. Also being a JavaScript developer, knowing how to manipulate the DOM yourself and do all the JavaScript stuff you're going to do in the intro class, but also knowing how to use a library that does that for you, such as React. Both very important skills.
I have a question regarding the SQL for was it Ruby on Rails. So is Rails a database?
No, Rails is a framework.
Okay, so
so
that's
we've talked about like Ruby is a programming language, like JavaScript is a programming language.
Mhm.
React and Rails are frameworks, which are just
Okay.
like very giant piles of Ruby or JavaScript code that somebody else has made that just makes your life easier. They've already built out a lot of stuff that you can use.
So what
Um,
is the database that we're going to be using then?
So SQL is usually when you get started, you start specifically with MySQL. And then once you start ramping up to more production-y stuff, you ramp up to Postgres SQL.
Okay. And last question, how deep into SQL are we getting? Like, are we getting to like where we're joining tables together, or like how deep are we going?
Honestly, I've not done the Rails course before, and I've only kind of looked into it. It seems to go like way deeper than it needs to be honest, because in order to use it with Rails, basically all you have to do is like kind of understand what a table is and what a database is. And then beyond that, once you're working as a professional developer, if you ever write a raw SQL query, something has gone majorly wrong. You should never be writing raw SQL as a professional developer. As a security person, that terrifies me. So basically, you just kind of need to like understand the concepts around it.
I gotcha. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think I would add to that, because I did look at the Rails curriculum. It does go deep into SQL. I think one nice thing is it is good to know how it behaves. So how to know what a joint is doing and how that is behaving. That way, when you are doing it in Rails, and it simplifies the code for you, you're like, oh, okay, this is what's happening in the background. So that's, you might find that in the curriculum.
I
Yeah, the
gotcha.
impression I got from John for why we do a sort of a deeper dive into SQL is just because it helps lay a lot of groundwork for understanding the overall structures of data and how to manipulate it and how to get it to behave itself. And I think also because it can be helpful if you're troubleshooting anything to have that sort of frame of context to help make it easier to find where things are going awry so you can do any kind of fixes that you need to, I think was his logic behind why we've structured the SQL portion of the Ruby on Rails class the way that we have. These are great questions. Keep firing them off.
I think one of the main deciding factors for people to choose one, like front end or back end, is the amount of jobs and I guess the quality of jobs. Like when they finish, like can you guys talk a little bit about that? Like, I don't know, yeah.
I guess I'll just start by saying that with COVID, everything's remote, right? So you have access to every developer job in the country right now because developers are not working in offices right now. So the pool of things that are available to you is ginormous. You can work any job anywhere. On the quality of jobs, I will just throw this out because it's one of my favorite things about Ruby is so Matt's is the guy who created Ruby. And there's a saying in the Ruby community of MINASWAN. And it's an acronym that stands for Matt's is nice, and so we are nice. And so you will find that people who are Ruby on Rails developers and people who are in the Ruby community are just ridiculously nice, kind, helpful people. And I've just found that to be kind of universally true. Like you go to a Ruby conference, everybody is awesome. There's lots of nonprofit Ruby on Rails programs. There's a big one called Ruby for Good. I encourage you to look into it. There's just like all kinds of awesome, cool, very kind people in the Ruby community. So in terms of job quality, it's really hard to beat Ruby.
Yeah, and I think it was touched on already, but every company, it seems like, is trying to ride the front end wave and modernize their applications. So getting more of their applications client side, getting it to be more performant and to keep up with the pace of web. So you'll see companies everywhere hiring for React developers, Angular developers, etc. That also means there's a lot of jobs, there's a lot of people applying for those jobs, learning front end so that they can try to get into that space. So there's likely a lot more competition trying to find a junior front end job right now compared to if you try to go for a back end role, particularly a technology that there's less developers learning, but is still being used, such as Rails. So just something to keep in mind. I don't think you'll have a hard time finding a React job if you go through that course, but the competition of the other people also looking at that job might be a little bit higher. So just something to keep in mind.
And I think I would probably just add to that, as quality of the job, I think once you start doing the interview process, the way the company treats you is a big way on how your life at the company may be. So while you're going through the interview process, pay attention. If they're, most of the time, they're super kind. My interview process were very kind people. But I also had interviews that, were just like, they threw a whiteboard at my face and it was like, figure it out, and I'm kind of glad that didn't work out. So I think while you're going through the interview process, you'll be able to tell how the company may function as well. And that might let you know if that's a place you want to work at.
Yeah, that's a great point. I think at the end of the day, if you're a front end or a back end developer, we're all just solving problems. And a lot of times we're solving really tough problems. So what it comes down to, what your quality will be in your job is going to be the environment. So what are the people like that you're working with? What is the application of those problems you're solving? Like, are you in an industry that you care about that's doing things that align with your values? And then what is the company like, and will they value you there? Are you going to fit in well there? Good benefits and company environment, et cetera. So it's less about like, what technology do you learn for what like your job's going to be like, and more about the surrounding factors. Because at the end of the day, React, Rails, they're just like tools, and you're just ultimately solving problems.
Yeah, I feel like that's a good rule of thumb, regardless. Like, just because you're going into an interview, it doesn't mean, am I going to be good enough? You can also look at it from, you need to be interviewing the company that you're interviewing with as well. Just like in a relationship, you want to make sure that you're getting your needs met as much as you're meeting the other person's needs. So don't be afraid to be interviewing your interviewers is a good rule of thumb too. And that'll help kind of give you some context about what the people that you'll be working for or with will be like too. So, and regardless of whether you're in tech or you go completely in a different direction and go into a completely different industry, that's just a good rule of thumb to have in general, is don't be afraid to interview your interviewers. Great. We had a question in chat from Marissa. Could you go over what type of computer is recommended? So you do need to have something that is other than a Chromebook. You need to have a good solid operating system with quite a bit of memory space available for your hardware for the advanced classes. So either a Mac, a Linux, or a PC is going to be ideal. And in most cases, I think for Ruby, I think they even specify 8 gigs of RAM at least. You can get away with less in front end, I believe. Tom, correct me if I'm wrong, but
I would recommend 8 gigabytes at least. So, and if you get into React Native, it can really be brutal on your system, and even 8 gigabytes can be tough.
Sorry, how much?
8. That's just
yeah.
I mean, but I don't. I mean, you could probably be fine with 4. I think getting through the class, but once you're out, like really working on a lot of heavy stuff, I think, and running multiple servers on your computer and things like that, it can be. I think you'd be better off with 8.
Okay, because I know I'm trying to figure out Mac or a different system, but Mac is very expensive. I think I was also reading somewhere on the website I dug up not to get the newer versions of Mac based on the chip they have.
The M1 chips, when they first came out, there was just a lot of packages that just wouldn't run. And so, and I guess I haven't really honestly looked into it for about 6 months to a year, but there was a lot of people that had a lot of problems with them early on. So I'm not sure that that's been sorted out or not.
I think I'll definitely to add to that. I do have an M1 Mac. I'm using it for work, and we have run into a lot of issues with it. So I'm not saying don't get it, but I am saying just know that they do have a lot of issues. Macs that are prior to that may not have a lot of issues. I'm on a Mac right now, and I do great with that, but the M1 chip is killing me. So, and then you could always go the other opposite and use Docker as well, right? So, I mean, there are other ways to get around it if you need to.
Yeah, I mean, I'll say too, I'm too much of a cheapskate to shell out the money for a Mac for my personal use. I did all of my learning to code on a super, super crappy, like 8-year-old laptop that was total junk. It had Windows on it and it couldn't even run Windows very well. So what I did is I just wiped the whole thing and put Linux on it. So it was just a Linux box, and like this thing was a piece of junk. Like the battery, like literally if I picked up the laptop, the battery would just fall out. So I had it like duct taped in, and it didn't retain power anymore. Like it was a piece of crap. But it did everything that I needed it to do. So there is no need to like shell out major dollars for a computer to get you through this course.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure that out right now before if there's kind of like a cheaper way I can do it, but I don't want to be so frustrated, or as long as there's not a heavy learning curve, I don't want to. I was trying to.
Yeah.
I would
Linux
say,
is more than enough.
yeah. When I started at university, I had a PC that I think I got at Costco for under $300. That thing lasted me a few years of school of like building, I don't know, hundreds of programs on it in all of my coursework. And so that would be totally fine. Like whatever kind of computer you can just get to run stuff will get you by. I will say like the front end community definitely favors Mac. And so you will just see sometimes things work a little bit better for Mac than for PC. It's nothing that I would say to deter you from using PC for front end development, just something to keep in mind that if you're leaning that way, that's just something you might get a little bit easier of a time going through front end using that.
Yeah, I mean, for backend, for Ruby on Rails specifically, you cannot use Windows. It will not work. Ruby on Rails does not work on Windows. So if you buy a PC, you will have to either do what I did and just completely remove the Windows operating system and replace it with Linux. That's the hardcore option. The second option is to do what's called a dual boot, where you turn on your computer and it asks, which operating system do you want me to open right now? And then the third option, and the option that is the one that requires you to have 8 gigs of RAM, is a virtual machine. So using a VM to run Linux, because you just can't use a Windows operating system for it.
And I think I'll just add to that. I did have a Windows when I started learning programming, and I had to use a virtual machine. But I also just want to add, the computer you start with might not be the computer you finish with, you know? So if you have something that works, and if you don't have to dish out the cash, it's not if you don't feel like you need to. The company I'm with, they send me a laptop. So many software companies might send you what you might need. It's not always the case.
Yeah, once you get a job, they will send you their computer. You won't be working on your own stuff.
Yeah,
It'll probably be really nice too.
Yeah, like I have a Mac that I did not pay for.
I've never, So just what you start with is not what you might end up with for the rest of your life. So just a thought.
If you have a machine that's working well enough for you now, and it's just a matter of memory space, if you are, have a lot of stuff on it for personal use, then you can always look into getting like an external hard drive or something that can, store some of these things and help with the memory space. And that would be a little bit more
RAM, not hard drive, that becomes the limiting factor, because RAM is what is eaten up by VM, not the hard disk space necessarily.
Yeah.
Is there somebody I can direct. So I just want to make sure, like before, I definitely know that I'm going to need a laptop. Is there somebody, because I'm just hearing like a lot of different options or things I could do. Is there somebody I could DM specifically just before I buy or make a laptop purchase?
I guess, are you sure that you are going to buy something, or do you have a machine now that you're just not sure if you want to replace it?
So right now, basically I have like an old company computer, but that will have to go.
Okay.
I'll need a personal laptop.
I would say message in the channel for your class. I don't know that I'm in there, so someone could probably add me and I'd be happy to respond as well, but you'll probably get more answers and advice that way instead of going to one particular person. And then the last thing on a Mac, if you do decide to go backend and you don't want to mess with virtual machines or dual booting or anything like that, so you decide to get a Mac, definitely look into like the refurbished route. So when I was finishing up school and I had to change computers, I got like a years older refurbished MacBook, just so I had it, but it was not the newest technology, certainly. And that thing has like, it still runs perfectly. Like I got it after 5 years of having it. So like MacBooks do hold up pretty good if you keep them. They're gonna run out of space, and the software updates, you know, it'll fill up space on this computer. But in terms of its ability to perform, it has been fine. And it was certainly cheaper than like a brand new MacBook. So definitely look that route of a used or refurbished one if you need to buy one.
Yeah, I second that, Elliot. It's like if you really want to go the Mac route and you don't want to spend all the money on like brand new ones, look for used or refurbished secondhand. You definitely don't need like the cutting edge technology. Get like, because like they were saying that the M1 chip, which is the latest one, is causing problems. So usually a lot of the newest hardware has a lot of bugs to work out with the technology. So you want to go like 1 or 2 generations before or something like that.
Thank you for sharing all that.
Okay, well, we're almost to the end here. So if anybody has any final questions, go ahead and share those questions now and we'll cover them, and then we'll be wrapping up.
I had a quick question about, I think Tom mentioned React Native. Will that be covered in the front end cohort?
No, but it's pretty, well, it's pretty similar. I mean, it's overall, it's like React. Well, yeah, we don't cover it in the class though. But it's pretty easy to pick up after React, other than it can be a headache sometimes. It comes with its own new set of challenges, but it's still React. And then it just compiles down differently to what languages? I'm drawing a blank right now. To Java and
Swift
and Swift,
right.
yeah.
Yeah, so it's kind of like you're writing React, you're still building components and using like JSX syntax, but the components you're using to build are entirely different. You have to use like certain components to build the app bar and the pages and all that sort of thing. The styling looks a little bit different. It's not web. So you don't do routing the same, you don't do styling the same, you don't do markup the same. So even though it's kind of similar syntax, the way you apply it is completely different. So learning React for web would be a good stepping stone if you want to learn React Native, just from a syntax point of view. But you'll have to learn a lot about mobile development specifically and how to use React Native for mobile development in a different class or as a follow-up for sure. Maybe one day, Code the Dream will have a React Native class.
So, secretly, I hope React Native disappears and it just gets taken over by PWAs. But I read a really interesting article about React Native, them trying to build React Native for web also, so that it'll,
Yep.
which is just also totally bizarre to me. But
That sounds kind of redundant. React Native for web. Isn't React already for web? I don't know.
So you build one application that runs on mobile or it can run on web. and it uses React native like code.
Right. We'd compile down into JavaScript for the browser.
Oh, okay.
I'm assuming it, right?
Yeah, something like that.
All right, well, if there aren't any other questions, then we will go ahead and wrap up for the evening. I'm going to go ahead and end recording.
Thank you.